Hello and welcome to Service Management General Concepts, Part 1. My name is Lowell Amos, and I'm an ITIL expert, and for the next few minutes, I'm going to talk to you about some of the basic principles and general concepts of service management. These are important concepts and definitions for you to understand in order to prepare for the ITIL V3 Foundations examination. So let's get started. In this lesson, I'm going to cover some basic ideas. The first is, what are good practices? And what are services? Both of these ideas are at the core of the ITIL framework. We're going to spend a little time talking about service owners and provider types, business units and service units, and resources and capabilities in the context of developing strategic assets for IT service management. We'll talk about who the stakeholders are in service management, the role of governance, and do a basic review of service management as a practice. So what are good practices? A good practice, sometimes called a best practice, is a proven set of activities or processes that have been used by multiple organizations to achieve positive results. ITIL is an example of a good practice. Good practices are at the core of service management, as they provide guidance on what to do. The objective of a good practice is to meet an internal objective or an external regulation or requirement. A good practice should enable business outcomes. Good practices can come from a variety of sources, both public and private. There are proprietary frameworks that organizations have developed and oftentimes sell. There are also external standards like ISO, industry practices like ITIL, academic research, training, and education. What are enablers? Enablers are things that allow a good practice to occur. They can be employees, customers, suppliers, consultants, or technology. Drivers are people or events that cause something to happen. They're the reason we do things. It might be things like regulation that's changed. A big driver was the SOX regulation that was passed that changed a lot of processes and controls that had to be put in place in an organization to meet that requirement. Business drivers can be changes in the industry. Customers have changing preferences and wants and needs, and organizations strive to change to meet those ever-changing wants and needs. So let's talk about services. In a previous lesson, we defined a service as a means of delivering value to a customer by facilitating outcomes that they want to achieve without the specific ownership of the costs and risks associated with it. Some of the examples were cell phone service providers, the electric company, and a hospital billing system. All of those services can provide outcomes that customers want to achieve. In the case of the electric company, it allows us to see in the dark when we come home and flip on our light switch. That's the business outcome. In the example of the cell phone, the service provider is responsible for managing the costs and risks, and I would argue that better than 99% of the people who consume the service have no idea how cell technology works. And that's the point. They don't have to. They can pay their monthly fee, make use of the service, get all the benefits without understanding or having to deal with the costs and risks of managing a cell network. Services should provide value to customers and satisfy the objectives or meet those business outcomes that customers wish to achieve. So what constitutes value? We spend a lot of time talking about creating value for customers. So let's take a minute to define it. Value is defined in two dimensions. The first is utility, or fitness of purpose. It's what the service enables the outcomes to occur. It can improve performance, or it can relax a constraint. Warranty is basically fitness of use, or how the service is delivered. We're going to talk a little bit more about warranty in a minute, but both must be present in order for value to be created for a customer. If we lay out utility and warranty in a logic gate, the utility supports performance or removes a constraint. Warranty, or fitness of use, is how the service is delivered. Is it available enough? Does it have enough capacity? What about security and continuity? If we take the example of the cell phone service provider, it's pretty clear that there is performance supported and the constraints are removed. We are no longer tethered by a wire to a wall phone. That's a constraint that the cell phone service provider helps us remove. It also provides us the ability to connect to people all over the world that also have cell phones. That's the utility component. Now let's consider the warranty. Is the cell phone service available enough? Your perspective as a customer of the cell phone service provider. Would the value be largely lost or degraded if the service wasn't available? Consider a cell phone service provider that meets all of the utility requirements, but is only available on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. The value proposition would be largely lost. Likewise, capacity. We could have all of the utility components, but our cell phone would only work as long as our neighbor wasn't using his. Clearly, that would be a capacity constraint that would be violated, and the value proposition would be largely lost. Security is another dimension of warranty that's important. If we didn't have a belief that our voice conversations and our text messages were secure and only received by those that we authorized to read them or hear them, then the value proposition of the cell phone service would be largely lost. Continuity, or is the service continuous enough? We have an expectation that the service will be there when we need it. Many people have gotten rid of their old landline phones and gone exclusively with their cell phone in order to have connectivity or communication with other people in the world. If the belief that the service would not be continuous, or that the cell phone provider could not recover from an adverse event, such as an act of God like a hurricane or tornado, then the value proposition for the customer would be largely lost. And that's why warranty is an AND gate. The service must be available and also have enough capacity, be secure enough, and be continuous enough. Any one of those that is lost seriously and adversely affects the value proposition to the customer. Utility is an OR gate. It can improve performance or remove a constraint and still meet the utility criteria, or it could do both. Both utility and warranty must be present for value to be created from the customer's point of view. So now that we understand what a service is and what value is, let's talk about service owners and provider types. A service owner is a role that is accountable for the service regardless of where the individual elements or underpinning technologies reside. In many ways, they are advocates or agents of the customer. They own the outcomes that the service facilitates, and they represent the services across the organization. They're a primary stakeholder for the underlying IT processes that must be developed and delivered in order for the service to function as designed. Service owners will identify and prioritize service improvements, and they often sit on change boards. And we'll talk a lot about change boards in service transition. A service provider is an organization that provides services to one or more internal or external customer. We oftentimes talk about the IT service provider in the ITIL framework. An internal customer sits inside the business unit. A shared services unit serves many business units, and an external supplier or service provider is an outsourced provider. So what's the difference between a business unit and a service unit? A business unit is a segment of the business which has its own plans, metrics, incomes, costs, and can be thought of as a profit center, and oftentimes is. It has assets and uses those assets to create value for customers in the form of goods and services. A service unit also has a set of assets that are used to provide services. In the case of an IT service provider, these services might be things like email, voice services, or backup and restore. Both business units and service units have resources and capabilities that they use to create value in the form of goods and services for their customer. A service unit uses service assets. Service assets are a collection of resources and capabilities required to sustain value to customers. A resource is a direct input, things like telephones, people, servers, applications. Relative to capabilities, they're easy to acquire. They're oftentimes things that you can write a check and get a resource. A capability, on the other hand, is the service provider's ability to carry out an activity. They're the functions and processes and knowledge that exist within an organization. The ability to coordinate resources to develop a capability requires management, processes, coordination, control, and deployment of assets. These are sometimes difficult to acquire relative to resources, but a resource has relatively low intrinsic value, whereas a capability allows us to configure resources in a way to deliver services and has high value. There are several stakeholders in service management or roles that we should define. The first is customers. A customer in the context of the ITIL framework, are those who buy the goods and services. They often interface IT through the service level management process and negotiate service level agreements. These are customers. People have the authority and budget to buy goods and services. Users, on the other hand, are those who use the services on a day-to-day basis. They primarily interface through the IT organization through the service desk, and they're the ones who consume email, make requests, and day-to-day consume the services by doing their job. It's important to have a distinction in your mind between customers and users. The way to do that is to think of customers as those who negotiate on the user's behalf to define the requirements of the service and who pay for it. Users is everybody else who day in, day out interfaces with IT, makes requests for things, and consumes the services. Suppliers are third parties who are responsible for delivering goods and services that are required to deliver IT services. If you remember, partners is one of the 4 P's of service design, and it's important that we understand and manage our suppliers. Internal customers are those customers that are part of the same organization as the service provider. These are oftentimes business units that the service provider services. For instance, the IT organization may provide services to human resources or the marketing department, but they're all part of the same organization, and that's the internal customer. External customers are customers that work for a different organization as the service provider, and service providers are generally managed through legally binding contracts when they engage with external customers. ITIL can also be thought of as a governance framework. It's a single overarching area that ties together the business and IT, and that's the whole point of IT service management, is to provide alignment to the business. Governance is a way of managing and measuring and controlling how resources and capabilities are applied. It provides common directions, policies, and rules that both the business and IT use to conduct business. Governance is what ensures that the policies and strategic objectives are actually implemented and that the required processes are correctly followed. Governance includes defining roles and responsibilities, measuring and reporting, and taking actions to resolve any issues identified. Governance is a critical component to delivering IT service management. So let's take a minute to review. What is service management? Again, the definition: a set of specialized organizational capabilities providing value to customers in the form of services. It's important that you not only understand and memorize that definition, but internalize it in the context of the other concepts that we're going to cover in future lessons. Service management is at the heart of the ITIL framework, and service management converts resources into services. Hopefully, by the end of this course, you'll understand how all those things work together and how those organizational capabilities do indeed provide value to customers in the form of services. And that concludes our introduction to some of the service management general concepts. We'll cover more in part 2, but what we covered today was a review of good practices. We defined what services were. We talked about the different service owners and provider types. We talked about the difference between a business unit and a service unit, and those strategic assets of resources and capabilities. And of course, we went back and we reviewed the basics of service management as a set of specialized organizational capabilities for providing value to customers in the form of services. I hope you learned something today, and I look forward to seeing you in future lessons.